Hi everybody, welcome to another book talk video. Today we're going to be discussing Rebecca as promised. And this, as I featured in one of my previous videos, is my copy that I've had for a number of years. Behold the gilding. So what can I say about this story that hasn't already been said? I would say that it was interesting having gone back and read it again now that I'm older, because when I was younger, I used to read it all the time, reread it over and over and over again. And I do have a copy of the 1940 adaptation, film adaptation of Rebecca. And since I'm older and since more time has gone by and it's been a while since I read the book, it was nice to go back and see some of the changes that they made in the adaptation, as well as some of the things that I didn't remember reading before, because I feel like I have a different understanding of the story now as an adult as opposed to when I was a teenager, which I think was the last time that I read it, maybe late teens, early 20s. When I used to read it, I used to think one of the biggest alterations, and I'm going to discuss this without spoilers, in case somebody hasn't watched or read the book, that one of the main supporting characters in the 1940 adaptation that I like to watch, there is one of the main supporting characters, you know what eventually happens to that person. However, in the book, in the original book, you don't know what's happened to that person. There are, to a certain extent, some loose ends that don't get resolved, in part because the story is written as a life still in progress. There's no definitive ending. There's a particular beginning. Well, sort of. I mean, you could argue that there really isn't a definitive beginning, because the novel is written from the perspective of the main heroine. And interestingly, I don't know if this is something that has been brought up by a great many reviewers, probably when you get more into the literary analysis of it. But it's interesting that I find it interesting that the main heroine in the book, number one, is not Rebecca. Her name is not Rebecca. But you don't find out who the narrator is. You don't know who this heroine actually is, because her name is never mentioned. The only name that you see mentioned is Rebecca. So it's interesting that, almost like the price of having her story told, you could say, is that she has to remain anonymous. But it's written from the perspective of the young woman who, over the course of the story, evolves into a more mature heroine who is willing to face a very difficult situation that she didn't create, but she is now involved in. I also think it's interesting that, because you see everything from her perspective, and because the main character is, she's naive, but not necessarily in a way that's irritating. Because I have an issue with characters who are, for lack of a better word, too much of the wide-eyed, naive damsel in distress. Because eventually it starts to feel fake to me. Can anybody really be that naive? But in the way Daphne du Maurier did it, it feels more like just she's inexperienced. She doesn't, even though she's traveling with this older woman at the beginning, and she has been a paid companion for a number of years and gotten to see places and do things that she wouldn't have been able to experience otherwise, because she comes from a middle class, lower middle class family. So they wouldn't have been able to afford to give her the broader education that she would have gotten had she been born in an upper class family. She really, number one, is she's handicapped because she's extremely shy. I think we've all experienced that. She feels, I wouldn't say necessarily that she's awkward, but she lacks a lot of confidence. There's a difference between being awkward and lacking confidence. You can be a little awkward, but still be confident enough in yourself that it doesn't really bother you. And you just take it as, well, I'm quirky. So, and that's the way other people accept it too. But with her, she has a serious lack of self-confidence. And because of that, she does get pushed around quite a bit, primarily because she allows herself to get pushed around. So part of the story is really about her getting to the point where she is willing to make her own decisions and not be so concerned about what other people are going to think, or be concerned about feeling like she's being compared to somebody else. Also, I do like, because this is a story that was written in a time and in a style where the authors really allowed you to get to know the characters instead of rushing right into the action, which I feel is something that is a lot more prominent now, both as a reader and as a writer. In many ways, you're pushed to get into the action, get into the meat of the story, almost 3 pages into the book, as opposed to in a story like this, you actually get to sit with the characters, you get to see them develop, you get to feel, you get a little bit more of a sense of the ins and outs of their personality, and therefore they're completely three-dimensional, or as three-dimensional as somebody who's partly anonymous can be. And you become a lot more invested in the characters, so that when you do get into the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of the plot, you actually care more about what's going to happen to not just the main character, but to everyone around them. And you have a greater sense of, whether it's the urgency or the tragedy, you're going to be more affected by what happens to the character. And I think that that's something that to a certain extent is lacking in a lot of the other genres that have become more popularized or trendy lately. So I would say, if somebody is not really, let's say, either not into classic novels, or perhaps hasn't had much of an opportunity to read classic novels, I would say that Rebecca is actually a probably one of the best places to start. Would I recommend it over Jane Eyre? Because Jane Eyre is another one of my absolute favorites. That's another book that I couldn't put down. Um, and I do intend to cover that at some point, once I find my copy, because I think I might have packed it away accidentally. But I'm not sure that I would. Well, it really depends. In some ways, I feel like Rebecca was probably the book that personally I needed to start out with when it came to reading classics. Now, of course, I learned classic poetry while I was in school, and excerpts of famous poems by famous poets, so I wasn't completely devoid of any contact with really famous, big name authors from history. But in terms of Jane Eyre, with the differences between, excuse me, the differences between the writing and the differences in the stories, I think for me, Rebecca was the best place for me to start because it gave me, as somebody who's interested in mystery, there's enough mystery within the story that makes you wonder, okay, now why is so and so answering this question in the way he's answering it? Why is this person seemingly hesitant when this topic is brought up? You do get the sense, even though you are seeing everything from the perspective of the main character, you don't get any other points of views. It's only hers. You do get the sense, if you start to read between the lines, that there are things being hinted at that she's oblivious to. And she's oblivious to it because, in part, because she's the newcomer. She comes into a new marriage, a new home, new staff, new friends, a new community, new village, completely a completely different world. So to a certain extent, you don't expect her to be able to pick up on the things that you would otherwise like her to. So there is an excuse. That combined with the fact that she's very shy, she's not really that much of a people person. She has been kind of pushed into the background to a certain to a certain extent for the better part of her life. But there are also assumptions that she makes, and I think this is interesting. The danger of making certain assumptions, the danger of assuming that a person is a certain way or means a certain thing just because that might be what you would do or what you would expect if you were in that situation. So I think that if you are looking to get into reading some classic literature, Rebecca would definitely be a good place to start. I really like the way that she wrote the characters who are kind of shifty. I like that she has at least one character who is guaranteed to get on your nerves. So it's kind of, sometimes it's nice for a story to have a character like that so that you can be rooting for something to happen to them. But and even though it does to a certain extent, in a way, I suppose you could say the story does leave you wanting a little bit more. Personally, I think and I'm trying to talk about the ending without spoiling it. I think really for me, it made me think more, and that could be because I'm coming back to it after a long absence and after some other things have taken place and changed in life. But personally, I felt like I could sit with the book and enjoy it for what it is, but at the same time, it made me think about the assumptions that people make, the stories that they make up in their own heads, partly without even realizing that they're making up a story that is at least 50% fictitious. And then when the truth comes out, that's actually the reason why they're shocked, because they had their idea of what the situation was really supposed to be, or what a person was supposed to really be about, all set in their head. And then when they realize that, at least in part, they were wrong, and sometimes completely wrong, that's actually the reason why they're shocked. They're more, perhaps more shocked about the fact that they got it wrong when it seems so obvious. And then if you draw their attention to the fact that, well, actually, no, you were getting a lot of clues about such and such a thing from such and such a person, and you actually were not completely ignorant because you were trying to be told something and it just went right over your head. Then sometimes that makes you feel kind of dumb. But speaking from personal experience, but I think that this is a good book to start out with. If you like something that has a hint of mystery, if you like something that's a little on the gothic side without being full blown um, gothic literature, I mean, I'm not really all that up on the difference between gothic literature and just something with a lot of atmosphere and hints of mystery as far as I'm concerned. Like I don't really bother to differentiate between the two. I don't even really pay attention much to genres except for if there's a particular genre that I don't typically like just because of the way that those stories tend to be written or what those stories tend to be about. But this is definitely something that, needless to say, I'm always going to keep this book. Because who wouldn't keep a book with a cover like this? But even if it didn't have such a pretty cover, I would keep it because it's such a good story. And I'm not going to spoil the ending, but speaking as a writer, I think that it ends in the only way that it really could end. And I think that's actually pretty thought provoking as well. So I hope that this was um, the kind of critique slash review slash discussion that inspires you or encourages you to read it if you're looking for something, if you haven't read it before, or if maybe you've seen however many adaptations. I don't even know how many different times the story has been adapted. But in terms of the book being better than the movie, I'm not sure if I compare the original story to the adaptation that I enjoy watching, I wouldn't necessarily say that one is better than the other, though to a certain extent I would say that actually, yes, the book is better in part because it gives you a depth that you can't get from the movie. Now, if they had done the adaptation of Jane Eyre, at that when one of the adaptations of Jane Eyre that I really like is actually a miniseries. If they had done Rebecca as a miniseries, and as far they probably have, if they haven't, I would be very surprised. If they haven't, I would be very surprised because it's a relatively long book. It is a novel, but it's a really easy read, and I was surprised that I got through it as quickly as I did. For some reason, I remember it being a lot longer. I guess I was so into it that it seemed a lot longer than it was. I was really living in the book, really living the characters. I think if they had done the adaptation as a miniseries, which was not really a concept in the 40s anyway, so you wouldn't expect them to do it, you could get more of the depth of the characters. You could get more, a more you would be impacted more by the atmosphere of the location, the history, the backstories of the various people who come and go in Mr. and Mrs. De Winter's lives. But I wouldn't say that Rebecca is necessarily better than Jane Eyre, or that Jane Eyre is necessarily better than Rebecca, speaking about the books now. They are both, each one is written exactly the way that it needed to be, I think. I will say that Jane Eyre has more of a complete, semi-complete ending, you know, traditional, wrapped up in a pretty bow and all that, as opposed to Rebecca. Rebecca, perhaps some might argue, is a little bit more realistic in terms of the ending. But I think that's primarily because while there are similarities because between the two stories because it's a similar genre, mm, you have different characters. They are different characters, different worlds. They have different minds. They're dealing with different situations. While, yes, there are similarities, the situations are actually different. And the character of the characters is different in several instances. So I would definitely say that I'm glad I started with Rebecca and then went to Jane Eyre because I think I ended up getting more out of both because of the order that I went in. Somebody else might not get that sense, but that was how it was for me. So I hope, again, that I was able to give you what you were looking for without spoiling it. I find that this particular book is difficult to talk about without spoiling it. So I hope everybody's having a good day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.